You didn't choose your patterns. You learned them. Long before you understood the meaning of words like personality, confidence, or self-worth, your mind was already taking notes. Not consciously, not logically, but biologically, emotionally, instinctively. Childhood is not just a phase of life. From a psychological perspective, it is a training ground, a place where the brain learns one core rule above all else: how to stay safe. Dark psychology reveals something uncomfortable about this process. Children do not adapt to what is healthy, they adapt to what is available. Whatever environment you grew up in, emotionally warm or cold, predictable or chaotic, your nervous system adjusted itself to survive within it. This is why behavior forms before identity. Before you knew who you were, your brain learned when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to express emotion and when to suppress it, when approval was rewarded and when it was withdrawn. These lessons didn't arrive as thoughts. They arrived as feelings. Safety became the priority. If being agreeable brought peace, you learned to please. If silence reduced conflict, you learned to disappear. If achievement earned attention, you learned to perform. None of this required awareness. Conditioning happens below language, below logic. The child doesn't ask, "Is this true?" The child asks, "Will this keep me safe?" Dark psychology calls this adaptive conditioning. Behavior shaped not by values, but by emotional consequences. And because these adaptations worked, they stayed. They hardened into patterns that felt natural, automatic, even decades later. This is why so many adult behaviors feel irrational but unshakable. You may logically know that you don't need to overthink, overgive, or overperform. But logic came later. Conditioning came first. What makes this especially powerful is that the brain confuses familiarity with safety. Patterns learned early become default settings. They feel normal, even when they cause pain. And because they once protected you, your mind resists letting them go. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, pause for a moment. And if this kind of psychological clarity resonates with you, consider liking the video and subscribing. This channel exists to help you understand why your mind works the way it does, without judgment. Because the goal here is not blame, it's awareness. You didn't become who you are by accident. You became who you needed to be. And once you understand that childhood was not just a memory, but a psychological blueprint, you can begin to see how those early emotional lessons still shape your reactions today, especially the emotional ones. That's where the next chapter begins. Once the mind learns where safety comes from, it begins to associate emotions with rules. This is where childhood conditioning deepens, not through words, but through emotional consequences. You didn't just learn what to do, you learned how it felt to do it. Emotional conditioning happens when certain feelings are repeatedly paired with specific outcomes. Approval feels warm, disapproval feels cold, love feels conditional, attention feels earned. Over time, the brain links emotion to behavior and turns those links into automatic responses. Dark psychology explains this simply. Emotions teach faster than logic. A child doesn't need to be told, "Don't express anger." The withdrawal of affection after anger does the teaching. A child doesn't need instructions to become helpful or compliant. The relief that follows praise does the work. This is how emotional reactions become internal rules. You learn when it's safe to speak and when silence is better. You learn whether vulnerability brings comfort or discomfort. You learn if mistakes are tolerated or punished. These lessons are absorbed not as memories, but as instincts. They shape your nervous system's expectations long before you can reflect on them. What makes emotional conditioning so powerful is repetition. When the same emotional pattern happens again and again, the brain stops questioning it. It accepts it as reality. If love arrives only when you behave a certain way, the mind concludes that behavior equals worth. If conflict leads to emotional withdrawal, the mind concludes that harmony must be preserved at all costs. This is how fear, guilt, and approval become conditioning tools, without anyone consciously intending harm. Fear teaches avoidance, guilt teaches responsibility for others' emotions, approval teaches performance. None of these are chosen. They are learned responses to emotional environments. As you grow older, these responses don't disappear. They go underground. You stop noticing them as childhood adaptations and start experiencing them as personality traits. You say things like, "I've always been like this," without realizing that always began very early. Dark psychology highlights an important detail here. Emotional conditioning does not update automatically. The mind assumes that what was once necessary is still relevant. Even when the environment changes, the internal rules remain active. This is why you might feel anxiety without obvious danger, why you might feel guilty for resting, why you might seek validation even when you're competent. These feelings are echoes of emotional lessons learned when your system was still forming. And because these responses once worked, the brain keeps using them. It doesn't ask if they're healthy. It asks if they're familiar. But familiarity has a cost, because when emotional conditioning runs in the background, it quietly shapes adult behavior. You repeat patterns without understanding why. You react before thinking. You feel pulled into roles that feel strangely familiar, even when they don't serve you anymore. This is where childhood conditioning reveals its long shadow, not in memory, but in repetition. And that repetition, the tendency to recreate old emotional dynamics in new situations, is where the next chapter begins. Once emotional conditioning is in place, it doesn't stay in the past. It follows you forward, quietly, consistently. And this is where many people feel the most confused. Why do I keep ending up in the same situations, even when I want something different? Dark psychology offers a blunt answer. The mind does not seek happiness, it seeks familiarity. This is known as repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate emotional dynamics that feel known, even when they are painful. The brain is wired to trust what it recognizes. Familiar patterns feel predictable. Predictability feels safe. And safety, to a nervous system shaped in childhood, matters more than comfort. This is why unfamiliar peace can feel unsettling. When you encounter calm relationships, healthy boundaries, or emotional consistency, something inside you may feel uneasy. Not because anything is wrong, but because your system doesn't know how to navigate it. There are no old rules to follow, no roles to play, no familiar signals to respond to. So the mind drifts back toward what it understands. You may notice yourself drawn to emotionally unavailable people, or situations where you must prove your worth, or environments where your needs come second. These dynamics mirror early emotional conditions, not because you want to suffer, but because your nervous system recognizes the structure. Dark psychology emphasizes this point. The brain confuses known pain with manageable pain. It prefers a struggle it understands over a peace it doesn't. That preference operates below awareness, which is why repetition often feels automatic. This repetition also explains why insight alone doesn't break patterns. You may know logically that a situation is unhealthy, but logic doesn't govern emotional memory. Your reactions are shaped by emotional imprinting that formed before you had choice. Roles learned in childhood often reappear in adulthood. The mediator becomes the people pleaser. The quiet child becomes the self-silencer. The high achiever becomes the overthinker. These roles once helped you belong. Now they quietly limit you. What makes this especially frustrating is the sense of self-blame that follows. You wonder why you keep choosing the same outcomes. But repetition is not a conscious choice. It's a reflex, one reinforced by years of emotional learning. Dark psychology doesn't frame this as weakness. It frames it as efficiency. The brain reuses what worked before. The problem is that what once worked for survival may now work against fulfillment. This is where repetition begins to look like self-sabotage, not because you want to fail, but because your system is loyal to old rules. It protects the past version of you, the one who needed those patterns to get through. And unless those rules are brought into awareness, they continue to run in the background, shaping decisions, relationships, and reactions without your permission. This realization is uncomfortable, but it's also pivotal, because once you see repetition as conditioning rather than destiny, something shifts. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is this pattern trying to protect?" That question opens the door to the next layer of understanding. Because when old rules operate in new environments, they don't just repeat the past, they begin to sabotage the present. And that is where the next chapter begins. When patterns learned in childhood follow you into adulthood, they don't always look like memories. They look like choices, habits, just the way I am. This is where conditioning becomes most deceptive, because it starts working against you while convincing you it's helping. Self-sabotage is rarely conscious. You don't wake up wanting to undermine yourself. What actually happens is simpler and more unsettling. Old rules are applied in new environments where they no longer fit. Dark psychology explains this as a conflict between survival conditioning and current reality. The behaviors that once kept you emotionally safe now operate automatically, even when the danger is gone. Your mind keeps following instructions written years ago. For example, if approval once meant safety, you may still avoid disappointing others at all costs, even when saying no would benefit you. If emotional expression once led to rejection, you may still suppress feelings, even in relationships that feel secure. If attention had to be earned, rest may feel undeserved. These behaviors don't feel like sabotage, they feel responsible, polite, mature. But beneath them is fear that breaking old rules will bring old consequences. This is why success can feel strangely uncomfortable. Growth creates unfamiliar territory. New opportunities require visibility, confidence, and emotional risk. To a system conditioned for caution, this feels dangerous. So the mind intervenes. You procrastinate, you overthink, you minimize yourself, you hesitate at the last moment. Not because you don't want to move forward, but because moving forward violates an internal rule that once protected you. Dark psychology highlights a key pattern here. The brain prioritizes emotional safety over conscious goals. You may want fulfillment, connection, or achievement. But if those things threaten your nervous system's sense of safety, self-sabotage activates automatically. This is why people often get close to change and then pull back, why they repeat cycles they claim to hate, why they feel frustrated with themselves without understanding why. The mind isn't broken, it's loyal. Loyal to a version of you that needed these defenses to survive. What makes this stage especially painful is the internal conflict it creates. One part of you wants more. Another part is trying to keep you safe by keeping you small. That tension feels like anxiety, confusion, or chronic dissatisfaction. And because the sabotage feels internal, you blame yourself. You assume a lack of discipline, motivation, or strength. But the truth is more compassionate and more complex. You are operating under outdated emotional instructions. Once you see this clearly, self-sabotage stops looking like failure. It starts looking like misapplied protection, and this awareness changes the question entirely. Instead of asking, "Why do I do this to myself?" you begin to ask, "Who did I have to become back then?" That question leads directly into the deepest layer of conditioning, not just what you do, but who you believe you are. Because over time, adaptation doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes identity. And that is where the next chapter begins. By the time conditioning has shaped your behavior and triggered self-sabotage, it has already gone deeper than habits. It has begun to shape who you believe you are, not consciously but quietly through repetition. Identity is not formed by self-reflection alone. It is formed by adaptation. When you spend years responding to the same emotional rules, those responses stop feeling like strategies and start feeling like personality traits. You don't say, "I learned to stay quiet." You say, "I'm just a quiet person." Dark psychology explains identity as a collection of roles that once kept you safe. If being responsible earned stability, you became the responsible one. If being agreeable reduced conflict, you became the easygoing one. If achieving brought validation, you became the high performer. These identities were not chosen for self-expression, they were chosen for survival. Over time, these roles harden. They become expectations you place on yourself. You feel uncomfortable acting outside them, even when the situation calls for it. Rest feels wrong if your identity is built on productivity. Anger feels dangerous if your identity is built on peacekeeping. Desire feels confusing if your identity is built on pleasing others. This is why many adults say, "I don't know who I am without these roles." When conditioning defines identity, authenticity gets buried. You lose access to spontaneous desire because your system is always scanning for what's acceptable. You don't ask, "What do I want?" You ask, "What's expected of me?" Dark psychology points out that this creates role-based self-worth. You feel valuable only when you perform your role correctly. When you fail or simply rest, you feel guilt, emptiness, or anxiety. Not because you did something wrong, but because your identity was built around doing, not being. This identity structure also explains emotional numbness. When your sense of self is built on adaptation, there is little space left for genuine feeling. Emotions that don't align with your role get suppressed. Over time, the inner world goes quiet, not because you lack depth, but because depth was never allowed to surface. The most painful part of this stage is confusion. You may feel disconnected from yourself without knowing why. You sense that something is missing, but you can't name it. That missing feeling is not failure. It's the gap between who you became and who you are. And here's the critical shift. Realizing this is not an identity crisis. It's an awakening. Because once you see identity as adaptation rather than truth, you stop treating it as fixed. You understand that who you are is not limited to the roles you learned to play. Those roles were solutions to old problems, not definitions of your essence. This awareness doesn't erase conditioning overnight, but it changes your relationship with it. You stop defending identities that no longer serve you. You stop confusing familiarity with authenticity, and that opens a final essential question. If your patterns, behaviors, and identity were shaped by conditioning, what happens when you become aware of it? That question, quiet but powerful, is where the final chapter begins. Awareness doesn't erase childhood conditioning. It does something far more important. It creates space. Space between impulse and response, between fear and action, between who you learn to be and who you can become. Dark psychology makes this clear. Freedom does not begin with change. It begins with seeing. Most people try to fix themselves by force. They push against habits, criticize their reactions, and demand different outcomes without understanding the system underneath. But conditioning is not a conscious choice. It cannot be undone through willpower alone. It softens only when it is no longer running in the dark. Awareness brings patterns into the light. When you begin to notice your reactions without immediately obeying them, something shifts. You catch yourself before people-pleasing. You pause before overthinking. You recognize the familiar emotional pull before self-sabotage takes over. This pause is subtle, but it's powerful. It interrupts automatic behavior. Importantly, awareness is not self-judgment. It is curiosity. You're not asking, "What's wrong with me?" You're asking, "What is this response trying to protect?" That question alone changes your internal relationship. Compassion replaces criticism. Understanding replaces shame. Dark psychology emphasizes that patterns lose strength when they are observed. Conditioning relies on speed and invisibility. The moment you slow down and see it happening, it no longer has total control. You may still feel the impulse, but you gain choice. This is how new behavior becomes possible, not by fighting old patterns, but by creating space around them. With space comes flexibility. With flexibility comes experimentation. You begin responding differently in small ways, setting a boundary, expressing a feeling, tolerating discomfort without retreating. These small deviations matter. They teach the nervous system something new. The feared outcome doesn't always happen. Safety is no longer tied to old rules. Over time, the system updates, slowly, gently, but genuinely. Awareness also reshapes identity. You stop defining yourself by reactions you didn't choose. You see your history without being trapped in it. You understand that adaptation was necessary, but no longer required in the same way. This is the true act of freedom, not becoming someone else, but loosening the grip of who you had to be. You don't erase the past, you integrate it. And integration creates strength that isn't reactive, confidence that isn't defensive, presence that isn't performative. Because once awareness enters the system, conditioning becomes history, not destiny. And from that place, change no longer feels forced. It feels possible.